Hello, thanks very much for having me. I'd just like to also say thank you very much to the EAC for having me over here, and also for everyone in the audience for coming such a long way. I want to talk to you today about a type of pruning that's been involved in the UK now for 25 years called retrenchment pruning. And it's at a site that I've worked at also for 25 years. Yes, so I just thought I'd give you a bit of background. Hatfield Forest in Essex in the UK, it's near Stansted Airport, very close to Stansted Airport. It's 403 hectares. It has predominantly 8 species of trees, and it's thought to be the only intact royal hunting forest in the UK. And Professor Oliver Rackham described it without too much stretch of the imagination as one of the best preserved, if not in the world. It dates from the time of the Norman kings, so it's 1,000 years old, and it's one of the top 10 sites in the UK for saproxylic invertebrates. It's also a national nature reserve, special site of scientific interest, and it's also been managed now by the National Trust for 100 years. Just had its birthday in May. The trees the ones I'm predominantly going to talk to you today about are Carpinus betulus and Quercus roba. But in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in the rest of Europe, we call Carpinus betulus hornbeam, as its common name. The trees there are thought to be around 500 to 700 years old, and they're really, really special trees, really important for our cultural heritage as well. And it's thought that about 500 years ago, the branches were cut from the trees, made into bundles, and they were taken to London and used to fire the bread ovens of London. So these trees kind of fed London. I just wanted to talk first about slight differences in types of pollard. This picture was taken in Spain. It's not Hatfield Forest. It's a Fraxinus angustifolia. But this is what I would call a working pollard. You can see its branches, the small branches where it's been cut, are uniform in size. It's been cut, what we call in cycle. It's been cut regularly, and it's a working tree, meaning its branches are used. Sometimes, we know in Spain they're used for feeding animals, but also for firewood. And other pollards, the branches have been used for construction, and we also know for things like shipbuilding. But I want to talk to you about lapsed pollards. These are trees that the cutting has stopped, and the crowns above the historic cutting point have grown large. You can see this Quercus roba above the pollarding point at 2.5 metres. The branches have got huge. They're sometimes over a metre in diameter, and they're often full of microhabitats, dead wood, hollows, cracks, splits. They're brilliant habitat for bats, birds, all sorts of species. At Hatfield Forest, another feature of them is we know that often they shed branches because as they get old, they become tall, and they get caught by the wind, and they become brittle, and so branches and other parts of them can fail. You can see here, this is one of the hornbeam pollards at Hatfield Forest. And you can see that because the cutting cycle stopped, the branches become very long, and they get caught and blown out in winter gales. This can be really catastrophic. This is a Quercus roba, and often when we find big branches like this peeling out and breaking, it aerates fungi, the rate of decay speeds up, and the other branches that are left in the crown can become quite easily prone to wind throw as well. So it's a real problem, and ultimately when we find this happens, it can lead to the tree eventually demising or dying. So at Hatfield Forest, they recognised this problem, and in the 1970s, late 1970s, they started cutting the trees, and they were repollarding them, cutting them back to their original pollarding points. Well, they were doing this in just like a few hours. Unfortunately, after a number of years, the trees grew for maybe 2 or 3 years, but then they noticed one by one that they all died. So 90% of the trees that were cut died. You can see here in the next picture. This is a photograph given to me when I was working in Hatfield Forest by a man, and on the back it had a date on it. This was taken in December 1969, and you can see all the Carpinus betulus or hornbeam pollards, with full crowns before they were cut. I was working there last week, and that's virtually the same image. You can see that countless trees have been lost. They're no longer there, which is a real pity. Some remnants, but there are other trees there. And so I had a quick look on a Ordnance Survey map, and this is an 1880 map, and the little red circles are trees that have been lost since 1880, so a significant number of trees. There are still 884 others currently there, but that's a significant number of trees being lost in the forest. The little yellow dots on the other side, that's off-site, but that's farmland, and you can see the difference between how it's managed by the National Trust and then how agricultural land is being managed. All of those yellow ones have been lost. Of the 10% that survived, this is one of them, and you can see it's got a small crown, a uniform crown, so it looks like a working tree again. And just very briefly, at Hatfield, we still manage these trees, we still cut these trees, but we carry out what we call pole thinning, where about 50% of the stems are cut. They're allowed to regrow, and then once they've grown after about 3 to 5 years, we go back and we take the tallest stems off, and then it just becomes a cyclical way of keeping plenty of foliage on the trees, and it seems to have worked. We've been doing that 25 years. But there was a problem, so obviously with the pollarding at Hatfield Forest, with the trees that died, the National Trust recognised that was a problem, so that pollarding cycle stopped for about 15 years. And it was around this time that the Ancient Tree Forum had been formed in the UK, and people were starting to think about the way that trees grow. Old trees, especially. Ted Green, who Mikhail spoke about earlier, and Neville Fay from Treework Environmental Practice were developing ideas about how old trees grew when they got to their final stages in their life. And Ted Green coined a phrase that he said he noticed that old trees tend to grow downwards when they get old. And this, I think, is a Quercus robur, literally just a few hundred metres from where I work, where my office and yard is based in Suffolk. And you can see, I think this is a good example of a tree that's retrenching or growing down. The reason I've shown it to you is because it demonstrates really well how the crown has died gradually, or is dying gradually, over a number of, if not hundreds of years. And lower down, you can see a new crown forming. You can see on the picture taken in the summer, epicormic growth around the trunk and upper branches in that area. And that's really important because that's what we see that will keep the tree alive longer into its life. I'm a member of the expert panel for the Ancient Tree Forum at the moment, and we've been debating the word retrenchment for the last year, if not longer. And at the moment, we're thinking that we're trying to define retrenchment, and at the moment what we feel it is the crown dying back slowly over a very long period of time, a life phase, where it develops a secondary lower crown, and that secondary lower crown will then live on for many hundreds of years, potentially. But I think also that it's in combination with the roots dying back, because that secondary lower crown can't necessarily reform a full crown again. It just stays small. That keeps the tree going. So because of that, Neville Fay had a genius idea that perhaps rather than cutting the hornbeam pollards and other pollards at Hatfield Forest in one go, perhaps we could mimic retrenchment somehow mechanically. He was looking at ancient trees and was thinking about ways that they could be cut and made smaller, but still keeping them alive, and also preventing them structurally or catastrophically falling apart. So I was very lucky to be involved in the instigation of the retrenchment pruning program at Hatfield Forest at the beginning, in around the year 2000. And just before we started work, we were given these diagrams which Neville drew, and you can see how the stages of growth how the crown would be pruned over 30 years. He thought that if we cut the trees once every 7 years or so, and making them smaller overall each time, that would give the tree sufficient time to recover after each cut. And so that when you see the smallest crown on the smallest tree here, that eventually, as we pruned each time, the tree would recover, and then it would push growth down the crown, so that when you came to make the final cuts in 30 years' time, that there'd be a small secondary lower crown there ready and waiting. So as I said, work started in the year 2000, and this tree has become very, very important. This is myself and some of the guys at work on one of the hornbeam pollards, and this tree has become very significant, which I'll tell you about a bit later, but remember this tree. Here you can see one of the pollards after it had its first cut. Very small material was taken off, less than 50 millimetres. The upper crown worked, and then there'd be a period of waiting for 7 years before the next cut would be made. This is an example of an oak, a Quercus robur, that's had its second cut. You can see that at the top of the tree, everything's done completely. All the branches in the crown are cut, but you can see the wounds are starting to get larger at the top. An important thing to let you know is that the type of cutting that we're doing is internodal, so it's not like any type of conventional arboriculture that I've ever done. And also the size of material that was removed from the trees was huge in comparison to conventional arboriculture. We're also making cuts that, because they're internodal, what we call stubs. So it's just, and you can see where the climber is there, where his saw is next to that, that's a stub. And the idea of it being is that if stubs were cut over the crown, that you'd get a bushy piece of growth, and then hopefully the epicormic growth would extend down the stem. So each time you cut, it would extend down the stem. So when you went back to cut the next time, there'd be growth there. You can see here, this is a tree that's had 2 cuts, and it's due its 3rd cut. You can see the form of the crown. You can see where it's been cut and the regrowth pushing upwards. And this is after it's had its 3rd cut. And you can imagine to have its 4th cut, it would have to go. The final cuts would usually be about 2 to 3 meters above the bolling. So huge amounts of wood being cut and a huge amount of leaf and foliage being taken off each time to trees that are 500 to 700 years old in some cases. You can see here, this is after it's been cut, and then now you can look at the regrowth, which is really quite considerable, considering what old trees these are. So I've been doing this work about 10 years and sort of about halfway in, and I was starting to have concerns about retrenchment pruning because I didn't see the trees growing down. I just saw growth growing up. Quite incredible, really, that the vitality of these trees could produce this sort of growth. But I was getting nervous that we weren't seeing growth pushing down the branches as we'd expected. And this oak tree was the tree that really made me think that perhaps it wasn't working. And just to give you some idea, this tree was probably 30 meters tall when it was first cut, and so it's about 25 meters tall here. So a very, very big tree by Lap's pollard standards. And here you can see the branches this is cut branches that have been taken off, and you can see where the stubs are, and you can see the regrowth around those stubs, and that's about it. That's about where it extends to, just around the stubs, and not much further. If you look on the periphery of this crown of this tree, you can see on the edges, you can see where it was cut and then the regrowth. And what we were starting to notice is that regrowth was so dense, it was actually like a thatch, and it was preventing actually light extending down into the crown. And you can see lower down in the crown is actually quite thin. I was also starting to notice that with trees like this, as we cut them, what you've got to imagine is that the poles or the branches that we were cutting were sitting on top of what's maybe 500 years of growth, and all these trees are hollow, and so they're quite fragile. Each time we cut them, we notice the branches that we cut them become stiffer, and we're also starting to notice that the rates of decay lower down were speeding up as we aerated the fungi that were in the tree just by our cutting. I had other concerns as well, that particularly on Quercus robur, that and also Carpinus, that we were starting to see mildew, which was killing the leaves. And I was concerned that on such old trees that if we kept doing this, and we get repeated infections of mildew, it could potentially kill the tree. And you can see here from this image, it's the rangers at Hatfield Forest had tried to make a new pollard on a young tree, and where it's regrown and it's got hit by mildew, it's killed it. So significant concerns about that. This tree was the largest tree in the forest. It stands on the exit route. Again, originally 30 metres tall, and this tree had its second cut by when the time this photograph was taken. Unfortunately, we went to see it. It broke in half, completely failed. And I don't know if you can see, there's a little marker on there that's about 2 metres, so that's an absolutely enormous branch. It's taller than me. Failed in a gale in October. And what I think happened here is that the regrowth from the second cut, as it regrew, it actually grew taller than the original height of the tree. And so what we're seeing is that the growth from the pruning was poking its head out above where the original height of the tree had been. It's getting caught by the wind. And because we've got such dense growth on the ends of the branches, effectively what we've been doing is lion's tailing these branches. And so they were getting caught by the wind, and we're noticing trees starting to fail. It wasn't just things like that. Ted and Neville really are the godfathers and grandfathers, in Ted's case, of the environmental arboriculture sort of movement in the UK. And so I was struggling to cut these trees, because as we were coming to getting the branches becoming to the third and fourth cuts, the branches we were looking at were becoming larger and larger, but also they were full of microhabitats. And it struck me that when the original management plans were written for these, perhaps the focus had been on preserving the trunks because of the incredible tree soil that, sometimes 500 years worth of growth in the internal sections of these trees, which is the growth where we get all these incredibly important saprozylic invertebrates. But no one thought about the upper crowns. No one thought about the branches up there. And these branches, some of them are 200 years old, are equally important because they're also hollow. There is also tree soil in them. And we're also, excellent habitat for bats, etc. We're just seeing sort of all sorts of nests, rare fungi. So I became uncomfortable with doing the work, but it took me 15 years to actually convince other people that perhaps we needed to change what we were doing there. So in 2019, I gave a paper at the Arboricultural Association conference and flagged up that I was concerned about retrenchment pruning. And in January 2020, we had a meeting at Hatfield Forest, and it was decided that the retrenchment pruning programme would stop there and at other National Trust properties because of the numbers of trees we were losing, because of the microhabitat that we were losing. So then the issue was, what do we do with the trees that have been cut and the other trees, and how do we stop them from falling apart? And I think it's important to remember that when Neville first wrote the management plans, it was 30 years ago, nearly, and the climate has changed a lot then. So I'm not being critical of Neville in any way. I'm just saying I think that the climate has changed and that we perhaps needed to adjust what we were doing. But I was very keen to keep as much photosynthetic material on the trees as possible. And so with our pruning, you can see on this tree the limb out there to the right is long and extending. And it's a Fagus sylvatica pollard. And I could see potential for that limb failing and tearing down the trunk like you've seen on the other pictures. So what we've been doing is what we call reduction via thinning. And this is the tree after the work's been completed. And you can see it's quite subtle, but we've reduced the loading on the branch that might fail. And also, the way you place your cuts means that we don't encourage regrowth on the ends at all. You can see across the top of the tree it's quite flat, and a lot of these old pollards appear to stop growing in height as they get older. They plateau out, but they still grow sideways. So we're trying to basically get as much sunlight as possible. So we focus our pruning now purely on pretty much the lateral branches. We're not pruning the crowns overall at all, and we're focusing our pruning just on individual branches, but also in combination with more frequent surveying. I think trying to write a management plan for a tree for 30 years is quite a thing now. And so what we are recommending is that we go and look at these trees more frequently and stop trying to predict the future, and we just look at trees more regularly. And looking at them more regularly means that we end up doing less tree work to them, which is, in my view, a good thing. So this is that tree that I mentioned to you earlier, the one that I said was a picture from 2001, and this is after the retrenchment pruning program had finished. You can see this big limb out to the right with there's a gap in the canopy. That limb there is the one that I had worries about and thought had the potential to fail and pull down the trunk like we saw in some of those other pictures. So this is kind of the extent of work that we're doing. But this tree is important not from the fact that we just stabilised a branch and aren't really pruning the upper canopy anymore. It's because whilst I was working on the tree, I noticed that the branches, first of all, there were quite a number of overly large dead branches that I wasn't expecting to see in there. And also I noticed a canker on the underside of the branch that I didn't recognise. Squirrels are an absolute pest with the trees at Hatfield Forest, but they chew the upper sides of the branches, not the undersides. And at first we did wonder if it was squirrel damage. But what we found is that there's a new fungi to the UK which I found on this tree, which is Cryphonectria carpinicola. And it causes these cankers on the undersides of the branch. And you can see here that the orange pustules or stroma is the fruiting. Here it is again, and you can see where we've cut the branch in half, that the dysfunctional wood is from the underside of the branch where these cankers are. It was really cool to find a new fungi to the UK, but slightly worrying when I started doing some research into it that in combination with another fungi it can cause a decline. And so I got Forest Research involved, and they came and had a look at the trees, and we found another fungi on the trees, which is Anthostoma decipiens. And Anthostoma decipiens is rarely found in the UK. It seems to, or by the records, it seems to only fruit once about every 20 years. It's been in the UK around 100 years, but the records for it are so scant. And I think we went to look at these trees last year in June, and it likes hot, humid conditions. We literally, I think, were there the week it fruited. So we got very lucky in that respect. But the downside is, with Anthostoma decipiens plus Carpinicola Cryphonectria carpinicola, in combination, it makes a toxic cocktail, which makes this thing called hornbeam decline. So unfortunately, we've got the first case of hornbeam decline in the UK. Worldwide, there's only 3 papers on hornbeam decline. It seemed to originate in Iran, but we do know it's in Italy, Switzerland and Germany. And if there's anyone in the audience who has any experience or knowledge of this disease, I'd be really grateful to talk to you, because at the moment we're trying to work out how best to look after our trees with it. And you can see here how it thins the crown quite significantly. And so we're very concerned that we could lose more trees. And in its native Iran, they think about 10% of trees affected die. It does seem very slow acting though. But what we have noticed, and particularly from looking at the Italian paper, that the other trees that seem to be affected by this have also all been cut, and cut quite hard. And at the moment, forest researchers think that there's perhaps a link with the cutting that we've been doing at Hatfield. And I think what it is these huge reductions, taking off so much photosynthetic material, is a real problem, and meaning that they don't have a chance to recover and may have left them prone to this disease. So just to recap, we're not doing retrenchment pruning anymore. If we are pruning old trees, we're just pruning individual stems and branches only, and selectively. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.